Listen carefully, Netanyahu. I just broke your silence rule, and from the wreckage of your media control rises African truth you cannot suppress. You thought we'd stay quiet about Gaza genocide forever. You believed your propaganda networks would drown our voices and African leaders would fear your retaliation while you murdered Palestinians and controlled global narratives. You were wrong. I spoke the truth about your crimes on every platform. I united Global South voices against your propaganda. Your silence rule is broken. Stop murdering Palestinians or watch African voices bury every lie you told to justify genocide. Let me explain exactly how I discovered Western media suppresses truth about Palestine. I had been watching Western media coverage of Gaza for months and became increasingly disturbed by the systematic distortion of reality. Western news outlets that claimed to be objective and professional were presenting a narrative that bore little resemblance to what was actually happening. They described Israeli actions in sanitized language that hid the brutality. They presented Palestinian resistance as terrorism while portraying Israeli violence as self-defense. They gave disproportionate attention to Israeli perspectives while minimizing Palestinian voices and suffering. The systematic nature of the distortion suggested coordination rather than independent editorial decisions by multiple outlets. The language used across different Western media was remarkably similar. Israeli military operations were described as defensive actions or responses to threats. Palestinian deaths were reported in passive voice without identifying who killed them. The destruction of homes, hospitals, and schools was attributed to conflict rather than to specific Israeli decisions to target civilian infrastructure. I began documenting specific examples of media distortion to understand the patterns and mechanisms. When Israeli forces bombed a hospital, killing hundreds of patients and medical staff, Western media headlines questioned who was responsible and suggested it might have been Palestinian rockets, despite clear evidence of Israeli strikes. When Israeli soldiers shot journalists documenting crimes, Western media barely covered the killings. When Israeli officials made explicit statements about their intentions to ethnically cleanse Gaza, Western media didn't report these statements or buried them in longer articles where few would see them. The contrast between Western media coverage and coverage by non-Western outlets was stark. Media from across the global South, including African, Asian, Latin American, and Middle Eastern outlets, reported Israeli actions directly without the sanitizing language Western media used. They showed the destruction and suffering that Western media minimized. They quoted Palestinian voices that Western media excluded. They called crimes by their names rather than using euphemisms. The honest coverage made Western media distortion even more obvious. I realized that Western media distortion wasn't accidental or the result of different perspectives. It was deliberate manipulation designed to shape public opinion in ways that protected Israeli crimes from accountability. Western governments wanted their populations to support or at least accept Israeli actions. Honest coverage would generate public opposition that would constrain government support for Israel. Therefore, media coverage had to be controlled to present narratives that made Israeli actions seem justified or at least understandable. The control over media narratives was achieved through multiple mechanisms. Israeli government and advocacy organizations maintained extensive relationships with Western journalists and editors. They provided access, information, and framing that shaped coverage. They pressured outlets that published critical coverage by organizing complaints, threatening legal action, and accusing them of bias. They rewarded friendly coverage with continued access and positive relationships. The combination of incentives and pressure shaped coverage systematically. Western governments also influence media coverage through their own relationships with outlets, through funding of media organizations, and through the broader political environment where supporting Israel was expected and criticism was risky. Journalists who reported honestly about Israeli crimes faced accusations of bias and sometimes lost their positions. Outlets that published critical coverage faced organized campaigns questioning their credibility. The pressures created self-censorship where journalists and editors avoided honest coverage to protect their careers and their organizations. The result was that Western populations received systematically distorted information about Gaza that made them less likely to oppose their government's support for Israeli actions. People who relied on Western media for information didn't understand the scale of killing, the deliberate targeting of civilians, or the explicit Israeli intentions to ethnically cleanse Gaza. They were told that Israel was defending itself against terrorism, that Palestinian deaths were unfortunate but unavoidable, and that criticism of Israel was motivated by bias rather than by opposition to crimes. I decided that breaking this narrative control required speaking truth directly and repeatedly despite the risks. African leaders needed to use our platforms to tell our populations and the world what was actually happening in Gaza. We needed to call crimes by their names without euphemism. We needed to challenge the propaganda that Western media was spreading. We needed to refuse the silence that Western powers demanded. I began speaking publicly about Gaza in every forum available to me. In speeches to our National Assembly, I described Israeli actions as genocide and ethnic cleansing. In media interviews, I detailed the targeting of civilians, the destruction of infrastructure, and the creation of conditions designed to make Gaza uninhabitable. In social media posts, I shared images and information that Western media wasn't showing their audiences. In international forums, I challenged Western leaders directly about their support for crimes. The response to my speaking openly was immediate and intense. Israeli officials condemned me and accused me of spreading misinformation and bias against Israel. Western governments expressed concern about my rhetoric and suggested I was inflaming tensions rather than promoting peace. Western media outlets that had ignored Burkina Faso suddenly covered my statements, but framed them as controversial and extreme rather than as truth-telling about crimes. But the response from African populations and global South audiences was overwhelmingly positive. People expressed gratitude that an African leader was speaking truth that Western media suppressed. They shared my statements widely on social media, spreading them to audiences far beyond Burkina Faso. They praised my courage in challenging Western narrative control despite obvious risks. The popular support showed that people were hungry for honest information that Western media wasn't providing. I intensified my truth-telling by organizing a press conference where I presented comprehensive documentation of Israeli crimes in Gaza. I showed photographs of destroyed hospitals, schools, and homes. I played video of Israeli soldiers celebrating destruction and making genocidal statements. I quoted Israeli officials' explicit statements about their intentions to make Gaza uninhabitable. I presented the evidence systematically to make undeniable what Western media was hiding. The press conference was attended by journalists from across Africa and the global South, but was largely ignored by Western media outlets. The few Western outlets that covered it dismissed the evidence as propaganda without examining it seriously. The contrast between global South media that engaged with the evidence and Western media that ignored it demonstrated the systematic nature of Western narrative control. I began calling on other African leaders to speak truth about Gaza publicly. I argued that our silence made us complicit in crimes we had the power to expose. I emphasized that our moral authority as people who had suffered colonialism obligated us to speak for Palestinians suffering similar crimes. I challenged leaders who stayed silent to explain why they were protecting Israeli crimes through their silence. Several African leaders responded to this challenge by beginning to speak more openly about Gaza. They described Israeli actions as war crimes and genocide. They called for accountability through international courts. They demanded that Western powers stop supporting Israeli crimes. The growing chorus of African voices speaking truth was breaking the silence that Western powers had demanded. Listen carefully, Netanyahu and Western powers controlling the old order. Remember when you thought we'd stay silent about Gaza forever? Remember when you believed your media control would suppress truth? Remember when you assumed African leaders would fear speaking against you? I shattered every assumption. I spoke truth about genocide on every platform. I exposed your media manipulation with evidence. I inspired African leaders to break silence collectively. Your narrative control failed. Your propaganda died. Your silence rule ended. The breaking of the silence rule that Western powers had enforced through pressure and threats was liberating for African leaders who had felt constrained. Many had wanted to speak more forcefully about Gaza but had feared consequences. My example of speaking openly and surviving the backlash showed them that speaking truth was possible. The collective breaking of silence as multiple leaders spoke openly created safety in numbers that individual leaders lacked. The exposure of media manipulation was awakening African populations to how Western media distorted reality systematically. People who had trusted Western media as objective and professional were learning that it was propaganda serving Western interests. They were comparing Western coverage of Gaza with coverage from other sources and recognizing the distortion. They were becoming more skeptical of Western media on all issues, not just Gaza. The awakening was reducing Western soft power across Africa. The inspiration of African leaders to break silence collectively was creating a movement that was becoming self-sustaining. Each leader who spoke openly made it easier for others to do the same. The growing number of voices made it harder for Western powers to retaliate against any individual leader. The collective truth-telling was overwhelming Western propaganda through sheer volume of contradictory information from credible sources. The failure of Western narrative control in Africa was particularly significant because Africa had been a region where Western soft power had remained relatively strong. Many Africans had consumed Western media and had been influenced by Western narratives. The collapse of Western narrative control in Africa represented a major loss of influence that would be difficult to recover. The failure was spreading to other global South regions where similar dynamics were occurring. The death of Western propaganda's credibility came from the obvious contradiction between what Western media reported and what people could see through alternative sources. Social media allowed direct access to information from Gaza that contradicted Western media narratives. Non-Western media provided coverage that revealed what Western media hid. The contradictions destroyed trust in Western media among populations that had previously believed it was reliable. The ending of the silence rule that had protected Western support for Israeli crimes was enabling accountability that had been impossible when silence prevailed. As more leaders spoke openly about genocide, it became harder for Western governments to maintain their support without facing domestic political costs. As more populations learned truth about Israeli crimes, they pressured their governments to change policies. The breaking of silence was creating political pressure for accountability. The transformation of international discourse about Gaza from controlled narrative to open debate was one of the most significant impacts of breaking silence. Previously, Western media had controlled the narrative and other voices were marginalized. Now, multiple competing narratives existed and audiences could compare them. The open debate was revealing truth that controlled narrative had hidden. The transformation was permanent because the alternative information sources and voices couldn't be suppressed once they had emerged. Your legacy is 80 years of media control that suppressed truth about Western crimes while spreading propaganda justifying interference and narrative dominance that shaped global opinion to serve Western interests while silencing victims' voices, Western powers, and media. My legacy is breaking silence about Gaza that exposed your propaganda, inspiring truth-telling that destroyed your narrative control, and building global South media cooperation that provides alternatives to your manipulation. The 80 years of Western media control began after World War II when American and European media organizations established global reach through wire services, international broadcasts, and later through satellite television and internet platforms. The media dominance gave Western powers ability to shape how global events were understood worldwide. They could present their interventions as humanitarian, their interference as promoting democracy, and their crimes as unfortunate mistakes rather than deliberate policy. The suppression of truth about Western crimes was systematic and comprehensive. Media coverage minimized Western responsibility for coups, interventions, and support for dictators. It emphasized Western aid and development assistance while ignoring Western extraction and exploitation. It presented Western leaders as well-intentioned even when their policies caused massive harm. The systematic distortion protected Western powers from accountability by preventing populations from understanding what their governments were actually doing. The spreading of propaganda justifying interference was equally systematic. Western media presented interference as necessary to prevent worse outcomes, to promote democracy, or to protect human rights. The propaganda made interference seem justified or even noble rather than criminal. It shaped public opinion in Western countries to support government policies and shaped opinion in target countries to accept or at least not effectively resist interference. The narrative dominance that shaped global opinion gave Western powers enormous soft power that complemented their military and economic power. They could conduct interference while maintaining international legitimacy because their media control shaped how their actions were perceived. They could violate international law while claiming to uphold it because their narratives emphasized their stated intentions rather than their actual actions. The narrative dominance was essential to maintaining their global dominance. The soft power that narrative dominance provided was as important as military and economic power in maintaining Western global control. Military power could compel obedience through force, but it was expensive and created resentment. Economic power could coerce compliance through sanctions and incentives, but it required resources and generated opposition. Soft power through narrative control was cheaper and more sustainable because it shaped how people understood events and therefore what they considered legitimate or acceptable. The ability to conduct interference while maintaining international legitimacy was the key benefit of narrative dominance. When Western powers removed governments through coups, their media presented these actions as promoting democracy against dictators. When they conducted military interventions, their media framed them as humanitarian operations protecting civilians. When they imposed economic policies through conditional lending, their media described this as helping countries develop. The narrative framing made interference seem justified rather than criminal. The maintenance of international legitimacy despite violating sovereignty repeatedly was possible because Western media shaped global understanding of these violations. Media coverage emphasized Western stated intentions of promoting democracy and human rights while minimizing or ignoring the actual impacts of interference, including destroyed countries, killed leaders, and impoverished populations. The selective emphasis on intentions over outcomes allowed Western powers to maintain legitimacy despite catastrophic results of their actions. The violation of international law while claiming to uphold it was enabled by narrative control that emphasized Western rhetoric over Western actions. When Western powers invaded countries without UN authorization, their media emphasized the humanitarian justifications while downplaying the illegality. When they conducted assassinations and coups, their media focused on the alleged crimes of those targeted while ignoring the illegality of the methods. When they imposed economic coercion, their media presented it as legitimate policy tools rather than violations of sovereignty. The emphasis on stated intentions rather than actual actions was a consistent pattern in Western media coverage of Western interference. Media would report that Western powers intended to promote democracy, protect human rights, or prevent humanitarian catastrophes. They would minimize reporting on the actual outcomes, including destroyed democracies, violated rights, and worsened humanitarian situations. The emphasis on intentions over outcomes allowed Western powers to maintain positive reputations despite negative results. The narrative dominance being essential to maintaining global dominance revealed how dependent Western power was on controlling information. Without the ability to shape how their actions were perceived, Western powers would face much greater opposition to their interference. Populations in Western countries would oppose their government's actions if they understood the true nature and impacts. Populations in target countries would resist more effectively if they understood Western intentions and methods. The narrative control was essential to maintaining the broader system of dominance. The silencing of victims' voices was achieved through multiple mechanisms. Western media rarely interviewed people from countries experiencing Western interference. When they did, they selected voices that aligned with Western narratives and excluded voices that challenged them. They presented Western officials and experts as authoritative sources while treating victims' accounts as biased or unreliable. The systematic exclusion of victims' voices prevented their perspectives from reaching global audiences. The rarity of interviews with people from countries experiencing Western interference was striking when examining Western media coverage. When Western powers intervened in Libya, Western media interviewed Western officials, Western military personnel, and Western experts extensively. They rarely interviewed ordinary Libyans about how the intervention affected them. When they did interview Libyans, they selected those who supported the intervention and excluded those who opposed it or who described its devastating impacts. The selection of voices that aligned with Western narratives while excluding challenging voices was systematic across different situations. Western media covering the Iraq War interviewed Iraqis who welcomed American forces while ignoring Iraqis who opposed the invasion. Media covering structural adjustment programs interviewed beneficiaries of privatization while excluding workers who lost jobs or communities that lost services. The selective interviewing created false impressions that Western interference had popular support. The presentation of Western officials and experts as authoritative sources while treating victims' accounts as biased was particularly insidious. When Western officials claimed their interventions would promote democracy, media reported these claims as fact. When victims said interventions were destroying their countries, media treated these accounts as opinions that might not be reliable. The differential treatment of sources privileged Western perspectives over victims' lived experiences. The treatment of victims' accounts as biased or unreliable was often explicit. Western media would describe victims' statements as claims or allegations while presenting Western officials' statements as facts. They would note that victims had reasons to be biased, while not noting that Western officials had reasons to justify their actions. They would seek third-party verification for victims' accounts, while accepting Western officials' accounts without verification. The systematic skepticism toward victims while credulity toward Western officials shaped coverage to favor Western narratives. The systematic exclusion of victims' voices from global audiences prevented people from understanding the true impacts of Western interference. Audiences in Western countries didn't hear from Iraqis about how the invasion destroyed their country. They didn't hear from Libyans about how the intervention created chaos. They didn't hear from Palestinians about how occupation affected their daily lives. The exclusion meant Western populations made judgments about their government's policies without understanding those policies' actual impacts on victims. The prevention of victims' perspectives from reaching global audiences was achieved not just through exclusion from Western media, but through the dominance of Western media in shaping global discourse. Even when victims spoke through alternative media, their voices often didn't reach broad audiences because Western media had the largest platforms, the most resources, and the greatest credibility among many audiences. The structural advantages of Western media made victims' voices marginal even when they spoke. My legacy of breaking silence about Gaza exposed Western propaganda by speaking truth that Western media suppressed. The truth-telling revealed the gap between Western media narratives and reality. It showed audiences that Western media was hiding information and distorting events. It demonstrated that alternative sources provided more accurate information than Western outlets that claimed objectivity. The exposure destroyed Western media credibility among audiences that had trusted it. The exposure of Western propaganda through speaking truth about Gaza was particularly effective because the situation was so extreme that the gap between Western media narratives and reality was enormous and obvious. Western media described Israeli actions as self-defense, while independent sources showed systematic targeting of civilians. Western media minimized Palestinian deaths, while alternative sources documented thousands of children killed. Western media ignored Israeli officials' genocidal statements, while alternative sources quoted them directly. The contradictions were so stark that they couldn't be explained as different perspectives. They were obviously distortion versus truth. The revelation of the gap between Western media narratives and reality awakened audiences to the possibility that Western media was systematically unreliable. People who had trusted Western media as objective began questioning whether they had been misled on other issues as well. They began comparing Western coverage of various events with coverage from alternative sources. They began recognizing patterns of distortion that favored Western interests consistently. The awakening was spreading beyond Gaza to broader skepticism about Western media. The demonstration that Western media was hiding information and distorting events was achieved through presenting evidence that contradicted Western media narratives. I showed photographs that Western media wasn't publishing. I played videos that Western outlets weren't broadcasting. I quoted statements that Western journalists weren't reporting. The evidence made undeniable that Western media was deliberately suppressing information rather than simply having different editorial judgments. The demonstration that alternative sources provided more accurate information than Western outlets was destroying the credibility advantage Western media had enjoyed. Previously, many audiences had trusted Western media more than alternative sources because of Western media's resources, professionalism, and claimed objectivity. But when alternative sources proved more accurate about Gaza than Western outlets, the trust was transferred. Audiences began preferring alternative sources that told truth over Western sources that spread propaganda. The destruction of Western media credibility among audiences that had trusted it was one of the most significant impacts of breaking silence about Gaza. The credibility loss extended beyond coverage of Gaza to Western media generally. Audiences that recognized Western media had lied about Gaza began questioning whether Western media was lying about other issues. The skepticism was reducing Western soft power across multiple domains. The inspiring of truth-telling across Africa and the global South created a movement that was overwhelming Western propaganda through volume and persistence. As more leaders spoke openly about Gaza and other issues where Western media distorted reality, the collective truth-telling reached audiences that individual voices couldn't reach. The movement was creating alternative narratives that competed with and increasingly displaced Western propaganda. The creation of a truth-telling movement across the global South was transforming international discourse. Previously, Western narratives had dominated because few voices challenged them consistently. Individual leaders who spoke truth were isolated and their voices were marginalized. But as dozens of leaders began speaking truth simultaneously, they created a chorus that couldn't be ignored or marginalized. The collective voice was reaching global audiences and shaping understanding in ways that individual voices couldn't achieve. The overwhelming of Western propaganda through volume and persistence was evident in how coverage of Gaza evolved. Initially, Western media narratives dominated despite being false. But as more global South leaders spoke truth repeatedly, alternative narratives gained traction. Social media amplified truth-telling voices. Non-Western media gave them platforms. The volume of truth-telling eventually overwhelmed Western propaganda simply through persistence and consistency. The reaching of audiences that individual voices couldn't reach was achieved through the network effects of collective truth-telling. When one leader spoke truth, their audience was limited to their own country and those who followed international affairs closely. But when dozens of leaders spoke truth, media coverage multiplied, social media sharing expanded, and audiences grew exponentially. The collective impact reached populations across the global south and even some audiences in Western countries. The creation of alternative narratives that competed with Western propaganda was changing the information environment fundamentally. Previously, Western narratives had been dominant or exclusive in many contexts. Now, alternative narratives existed and were accessible to audiences willing to seek them. The competition between narratives allowed audiences to compare and judge which were more credible. The comparison increasingly favored alternative narratives that told truth over Western propaganda that distorted reality. The displacement of Western propaganda by alternative narratives was accelerating as audiences recognized which sources were reliable. The displacement was visible in declining audiences for Western media in global South countries. It was evident in social media where alternative sources were shared more widely than Western outlets. It was clear in surveys showing declining trust in Western media among global South populations. The displacement was becoming permanent as trust once lost was difficult to rebuild. The building of global South media cooperation was creating permanent alternatives to Western media dominance. African media outlets were coordinating coverage and sharing content. Global South news agencies were providing information that Western agencies ignored or distorted. Social media platforms were enabling direct communication that bypassed Western media gatekeepers. The alternative media infrastructure was reducing Western narrative control permanently. The coordination of coverage among African media outlets was creating synergies that strengthened all participants. Outlets shared journalists' reports, exchanged video footage, and coordinated investigative projects. The sharing reduced costs while improving coverage quality. It enabled smaller outlets to cover international stories they couldn't afford to cover independently. It created African perspectives on global events that challenged Western framing. The sharing of content among global South media outlets was building networks that functioned as alternatives to Western wire services that had dominated international news distribution. Previously, media outlets across the global South had depended on Western wire services for international news, inheriting Western framing and selection of what was newsworthy. Now, global South outlets were sharing content directly with each other, creating alternative flows of information that reflected global South perspectives and priorities. The provision of information that Western agencies ignored or distorted was filling gaps in global news coverage. Western media focused on events that affected Western interests while ignoring events in the global South unless they involved Western countries. Global South media was covering events that mattered to global South populations, but that Western media ignored. The coverage was providing more complete picture of global events than Western media's selective coverage. The enabling of direct communication through social media that bypassed Western media gatekeepers was democratizing information in ways that threatened Western narrative control fundamentally. Previously, Western media had served as gatekeepers determining what information reached global audiences. Social media allowed people to communicate directly without going through these gatekeepers. The direct communication was enabling truth to spread even when Western media tried to suppress it. The reduction of Western narrative control permanently through alternative media infrastructure was one of the most important long-term impacts of the truth-telling movement. The infrastructure, including coordinated media outlets, shared content networks, and social media platforms, would persist and continue functioning regardless of what happened to particular leaders or movements. The permanent infrastructure ensured that Western narrative control couldn't be restored even if Western powers tried. History will remember which media told truth and which spread propaganda. The answer is written in Western media distortions exposed through comparison with honest coverage, in broken silence that revealed crimes Western media hid, in global South media cooperation providing alternatives, in collapsed Western narrative control. You controlled global narratives for 80 years through media dominance. I broke your control by speaking truth that inspired others. The lesson is eternal. The proof is visible everywhere. The outcome is permanent. The historical record will document Western media's systematic distortion of coverage about situations where Western interests were involved. Historians will compare Western media coverage of interventions, coups, and other interference with documentary evidence about what actually occurred. They will find consistent patterns of distortion favoring Western narratives and hiding uncomfortable truths. They will conclude that Western media functioned as propaganda serving power rather than journalism serving truth. The documentation of Western media distortions will be comprehensive and damning. Researchers are already compiling databases comparing Western media coverage of events with coverage from other sources and with documentary evidence. The comparisons reveal systematic patterns where Western media minimized Western responsibility for harm, emphasized Western stated intentions over actual outcomes, selected sources that supported Western narratives, and excluded information that challenged Western positions. The exposure through comparison with honest coverage is making Western media distortion undeniable. When audiences can compare Western media's sanitized description of Israeli actions with video footage showing the actual brutality, the distortion is obvious. When they can compare Western media's claims about Western interventions promoting democracy with the actual outcomes of destroyed countries and increased authoritarianism, the propaganda is clear. The comparisons are destroying Western media credibility. The broken silence that revealed crimes Western media hid is one of the most important impacts of the truth-telling movement. For decades, Western media had successfully hidden or minimized Western crimes through selective coverage and distorted framing. The silence of Global South leaders who feared consequences of speaking truth had enabled this suppression. The breaking of silence by multiple leaders speaking truth simultaneously was revealing crimes that Western media had hidden. The revelation of hidden crimes was awakening populations to the extent of Western interference and violence. People were learning about coups they hadn't known about, interventions whose impacts had been hidden, and ongoing crimes like those in Gaza that Western media minimized. The revelations were generating anger at Western governments for their actions, and at Western media for hiding them. The anger was creating political pressure for accountability. The Global South media cooperation providing alternatives to Western propaganda was creating permanent infrastructure for truth-telling. The coordinated outlets, shared networks, and direct communication platforms would continue functioning and providing alternatives to Western media, regardless of what happened to particular leaders or movements. The infrastructure was making Western narrative dominance impossible to restore. The collapsed Western narrative control was evident in declining trust in Western media among Global South populations and even among some Western audiences. Surveys showed that majorities in many Global South countries no longer trusted Western media to report accurately about events in their regions. Even in some Western countries, trust in mainstream media was declining as audiences recognized bias and distortion. The collapse of trust was eliminating Western soft power that had been essential to maintaining dominance. You controlled global narratives for 80 years through media dominance that shaped how billions understood events, and therefore what they considered legitimate or acceptable. The control was comprehensive across television, newspapers, wire services, and later internet platforms. The dominance allowed you to present your crimes as humanitarian actions, your interference as promoting freedom, and your extraction as development assistance. The control was essential to maintaining your global dominance without facing effective resistance. I broke your control by speaking truth that inspired others to break silence collectively and by building alternative media infrastructure that provides permanent alternatives to your propaganda. The breaking of control wasn't achieved through a single action, but through sustained truth-telling that revealed your distortions, through inspiring others to speak openly, and through creating infrastructure that would continue providing alternatives. The comprehensive approach was necessary to permanently break narrative control that had been built over 80 years. The lesson is eternal because it applies beyond the specific context of Gaza and Western media. The eternal lesson is that narrative control is essential to maintaining unjust power, and that breaking narrative control through truth-telling is essential to ending that power. Those who control narratives can present their crimes as justified and can suppress resistance by shaping how people understand reality. Those who break narrative control through speaking truth enable resistance by allowing people to understand reality accurately. The proof is visible everywhere in the declining trust in Western media, in the growing audiences for alternative sources, in the spreading truth-telling by Global South leaders, and in the alternative media infrastructure being built. The proof isn't hidden or theoretical, but is observable by anyone paying attention to how information flows and how narratives are contested globally. The visibility of proof makes it impossible for Western powers to deny that their narrative control is collapsing. The outcome is permanent because the alternative media infrastructure and the awakened skepticism toward Western propaganda cannot be eliminated. Once populations have learned that Western media distorts reality systematically, they will not return to trusting it uncritically. Once alternative media infrastructure exists, it will continue providing alternatives regardless of Western efforts to suppress it. Once truth-telling has become normalized among Global South leaders, silence cannot be reimposed. The permanence comes from irreversible changes in infrastructure, consciousness, and practice. The historical judgment will recognize Western media as propaganda serving power rather than journalism serving truth. The systematic distortion of coverage about Gaza, Iraq, Libya, and countless other situations where Western interests were involved will be documented as deliberate manipulation rather than honest mistakes. The judgment will be harsh because Western media claimed objectivity while practicing propaganda. The recognition of Western media as propaganda rather than journalism will be based on comprehensive documentation of systematic bias. Researchers are compiling evidence showing that Western media coverage consistently favored Western interests over accuracy. They are documenting how coverage minimized Western responsibility for harm, how it emphasized Western intentions over outcomes, how it selected sources to support Western narratives, and how it excluded information challenging Western positions. The systematic distortion of coverage about Gaza is particularly well documented because the situation has been extensively covered by both Western and non-Western media, allowing direct comparison. The comparisons show that Western media used sanitized language to describe Israeli violence, minimized Palestinian deaths and suffering, excluded Palestinian voices, emphasized Israeli security concerns over Palestinian rights, and presented Israeli actions as defensive responses rather than as deliberate crimes. The patterns of distortion are undeniable. The systematic distortion of coverage about Iraq, Libya, and other Western interventions followed similar patterns. Western media emphasized humanitarian justifications for interventions while minimizing evidence that contradicted those justifications. They presented optimistic predictions about intervention outcomes while downplaying warnings from critics. They covered initial military successes extensively while minimizing coverage of subsequent chaos and suffering. They attributed negative outcomes to local factors rather than to the interventions themselves. The documentation of distortion as deliberate manipulation rather than honest mistakes is based on evidence that the patterns were too consistent and systematic to be accidental. Individual journalists might make honest mistakes in coverage, but when dozens of outlets across multiple countries all distort coverage in the same direction that favors the same interests, it suggests coordination, or at least shared ideological commitments that override journalistic objectivity. The judgment being harsh because Western media claimed objectivity while practicing propaganda reflects the betrayal of trust that this represented. Western media organizations presented themselves as objective, professional, and committed to truth. They criticized media in other countries as propaganda and state-controlled. They claimed moral authority based on their alleged commitment to journalistic standards. The revelation that they were actually practicing propaganda while claiming objectivity will be judged harshly because it was deliberate deception. Netanyahu and Western powers, you believed your media control would suppress truth forever. You assumed populations would believe your propaganda indefinitely. You expected African leaders would stay silent about your crimes. You thought your narrative dominance was permanent. You were catastrophically wrong. The belief in permanent media control reflected Western arrogance about their information dominance and underestimation of Global South capabilities to challenge it. Western powers had controlled global narratives for so long that they assumed this would continue indefinitely. They didn't anticipate that alternative media would emerge and provide competing narratives. They didn't expect that Global South leaders would speak truth despite pressure to remain silent. They didn't foresee that their propaganda would be exposed and their credibility would collapse. The assumption that populations would believe propaganda indefinitely underestimated human intelligence and the power of truth. Western powers assumed that controlling major media outlets would be sufficient to shape belief permanently. They didn't account for people's ability to recognize contradictions between official narratives and observable reality. They didn't anticipate that alternative information sources would emerge and that people would compare sources and recognize propaganda. They underestimated the human desire for truth. The expectation that African leaders would stay silent about Western crimes was based on historical patterns where fear of consequences kept most leaders quiet. Western powers had successfully intimidated most Global South leaders into silence through threats of sanctions, aid cuts, coups, and other retaliation. They assumed this intimidation would continue working. They didn't anticipate that some leaders would prioritize truth and justice over avoiding consequences. They didn't foresee that one leader speaking truth would inspire others and create movement. The thought that narrative dominance was permanent reflected failure to recognize that dominance based on control rather than legitimacy is inherently fragile. Western narrative dominance depended on controlling major media outlets and suppressing alternative voices. It wasn't based on Western media actually being more accurate or trustworthy than alternatives. Once alternative voices emerged and audiences could compare, the dominance collapsed because it had no legitimate foundation. The permanence was illusion. You were catastrophically wrong about all these assumptions because truth ultimately prevails over propaganda, because people recognize distortion when they can compare sources, because leaders who speak truth inspire others to do the same, and because dominance based on control rather than legitimacy is fragile and collapses when challenged. The catastrophic nature of being wrong reflects how completely Western narrative control has collapsed and how thoroughly Western media credibility has been destroyed. I spoke truth about Gaza genocide on every platform available, including speeches, media interviews, social media posts, and international forums. I exposed your media distortions with evidence comparing Western coverage with reality. I inspired other leaders to break silence collectively through my example and through direct encouragement. I built Global South media cooperation that provides alternatives to your propaganda through coordinating coverage and sharing content. The speaking of truth on every platform available was strategic and comprehensive. I used official speeches to speak truth to domestic and international audiences. I gave interviews to African and Global South media outlets to reach their audiences. I posted on social media to reach younger audiences and to enable direct sharing. I spoke at international forums to reach diplomatic audiences and global media. The multi-platform approach ensured truth reached diverse audiences through multiple channels. The exposure of media distortions with evidence was essential to making the exposure credible and impactful. I didn't simply claim Western media was biased. I showed specific examples of distortion with evidence. I compared Western media headlines with video footage showing what actually happened. I contrasted Western media's sanitized descriptions with victims' accounts of their experiences. I presented Israeli officials' statements that Western media didn't report. The evidence made the distortion undeniable. The inspiration of other leaders to break silence collectively was achieved through my example showing that speaking truth was possible and through direct encouragement in private conversations. Other leaders who had wanted to speak truth but feared consequences saw that I spoke openly and survived. They gained confidence that they could do the same. My direct encouragement in bilateral meetings gave them additional motivation and assurance that they wouldn't be isolated if they spoke openly. The building of Global South media cooperation through coordinating coverage and sharing content was creating permanent infrastructure for truth-telling. The cooperation involved regular consultations among media leaders about coverage priorities, sharing of journalists' reports and footage, and coordination of investigative projects. The cooperation was strengthening all participating outlets and was creating networks that would persist and grow over time. I proved your narrative control ends when we refuse silence by demonstrating that speaking truth despite pressure breaks the silence that enabled your propaganda, that collective truth-telling overwhelms your distortions, and that alternative media infrastructure makes your dominance impossible to restore. Your media credibility is gone among Global South populations that recognize your systematic distortion. Your propaganda is exposed through comparisons with honest coverage that reveal your lies. Your silence rule is broken as leaders speak truth despite your threats. Your narrative control collapsed as alternative voices and infrastructure emerged. Your soft power died as trust in your media disappeared. We have truth about your crimes that your media tried hiding, including genocide in Gaza, coups across the Global South, interventions that destroyed countries, and exploitation disguised as development. We have voices speaking openly despite your pressure to silence us. We have alternative media providing honest coverage that exposes your propaganda. We have audiences rejecting your narratives and seeking truth from alternative sources. We have victory over your narrative control that was essential to your dominance. The transformation is spreading as Global South voices break silence and alternative media provides truth that Western propaganda suppressed. Your era is finished. Our time is beginning. The change is irreversible. The future belongs to the Global South that speaks truth instead of accepting your silence rules and builds alternative media instead of depending on your propaganda outlets. I proved it works by speaking openly about Gaza and inspiring collective truth-telling that broke your narrative control. Other Global South leaders are proving it by speaking truth about your crimes despite your pressure. Alternative media outlets are proving it by providing honest coverage that audiences trust more than your propaganda. Global South truth guarantees everything because speaking we expose your crimes that your propaganda hid, and united our voices overwhelm your distortions, and determined we will not be silenced by your threats, and nothing can prevent us from telling truth that destroys your lies and building media systems serving truth instead of your power forever, and audiences choosing our honest coverage over your propaganda, and credibility flowing from truth-telling to us, while draining from your propaganda outlets and soft power shifting from you to us, as populations trust our truth over your lies, and the just information order emerging where truth prevails over propaganda, and where victims' voices reach global audiences, and where media serves people instead of power. And nothing can restore your narrative dominance because trust once lost cannot be rebuilt, and alternative infrastructure once established cannot be eliminated, and truth once spoken cannot be unheard, and the awakening once achieved cannot be reversed. And our determination to speak truth is permanent and unbreakable, and guarantees that your era of controlling global narratives through propaganda is finished forever. The guarantee that Global South truth provides is absolute and comprehensive because it rests on foundations that cannot be shaken by Western pressure or propaganda. The guarantee comes from our collective determination to speak truth, from the infrastructure we have built to amplify our voices, from the audiences that have learned to trust us over Western propaganda, and from the irreversible nature of the awakening we have achieved. The guarantee is permanent because it depends on our own actions and consciousness rather than on Western cooperation or acceptance. The exposure of Western crimes through our truth-telling is revealing to global audiences what Western propaganda had hidden for decades. We are speaking openly about the coups Western powers sponsored, the interventions they conducted, the leaders they assassinated, the resources they stole, and the populations they impoverished. We are providing evidence that documents these crimes comprehensively. We are naming perpetrators and describing methods. We are quantifying impacts and connecting historical crimes to present inequalities. The exposure is comprehensive and devastating to Western claims of moral authority. The crimes that Western propaganda hid included not just distant historical events, but ongoing contemporary crimes. Western media was hiding the scale and nature of Israeli genocide in Gaza. They were minimizing Western responsibility for chaos in Libya, Syria, and other countries where Western interventions had destroyed functioning societies. They were ignoring Western support for dictators and human rights abusers when those dictators served Western interests. They were concealing Western extraction of resources through unfair contracts and exploitative economic arrangements. The hiding of these crimes allowed them to continue without effective opposition. The overwhelming of Western distortions through our united voices is achieving what individual voices could never accomplish. When one leader speaks truth, Western propaganda can dismiss or ignore that voice. When dozens of leaders speak truth simultaneously, Western propaganda cannot suppress all voices. When hundreds of media outlets across the Global South report honestly, Western propaganda cannot drown them out. The volume and persistence of truth-telling is overwhelming Western propaganda's capacity to distort and suppress. The unity of our voices is multiplying their impact exponentially. Each voice speaking truth validates and amplifies other voices. Each leader who speaks openly makes it easier for others to do the same. Each media outlet providing honest coverage strengthens the credibility of other outlets doing the same. The unity creates network effects where the whole is greater than the sum of parts. The collective truth-telling is overwhelming Western propaganda through sheer volume and mutual reinforcement. The determination to not be silenced by Western threats is the psychological foundation of our truth-telling. We have calculated that the costs of silence exceed the costs of speaking truth. Silence makes us complicit in crimes we oppose. It betrays victims who need our voices. It undermines our own credibility and moral authority. It perpetuates injustices that harm us all. Speaking truth may bring Western retaliation, but silence brings moral corruption. We choose truth despite threats because the alternative is worse. The threats that Western powers use to enforce silence include sanctions, aid cuts, diplomatic isolation, media attacks, and support for opposition groups. These threats are real and can impose significant costs, but they are not existential threats. Countries can survive sanctions through alternative trade relationships. They can fund development without Western aid. They can function despite diplomatic isolation. They can withstand media attacks and political opposition. The threats are manageable, making the choice to speak truth despite them rational and sustainable. The impossibility of preventing us from telling truth comes from the diffusion of our voices and the infrastructure supporting them. Western powers cannot silence 134 countries simultaneously. They cannot shut down hundreds of media outlets across multiple continents. They cannot prevent billions of people from sharing information through social media. They cannot restore ignorance once populations have been awakened to truth. The distributed nature of our truth-telling makes it impossible to suppress. The building of media systems serving truth instead of Western power is creating permanent alternatives to Western propaganda. We are establishing media outlets owned and controlled by global South entities that answer to our populations rather than to Western interests. We are training journalists in professional standards that prioritize accuracy and serving audiences over serving power. We are creating distribution networks that reach global audiences without depending on Western platforms. We are building complete media ecosystems that function independently of Western control. The media systems we are building operate according to different principles than Western propaganda outlets. Our outlets prioritize truth over protecting power. They give voice to victims over privileging official sources. They report on events that matter to our populations over events that matter to Western interests. They apply skepticism equally to all powerful actors rather than reserving it for Western enemies while trusting Western officials. The different principles produce different coverage that serves truth rather than power. The permanence of these alternative media systems comes from their institutional independence and their responsiveness to audiences. The outlets are owned by entities that don't depend on Western approval or support. They are funded through mechanisms that don't give Western powers leverage. They answer to audiences that value truth over propaganda. The independence and responsiveness ensure they will continue providing alternatives to Western propaganda regardless of Western pressure. The choosing of our honest coverage over Western propaganda by growing audiences is the ultimate validation of our approach. Audiences are voting with their attention and trust. They are turning away from Western outlets that they recognize as propaganda and toward our outlets that provide truth. The audience shift is measurable in declining Western media audiences in global South countries and growing audiences for alternative sources. The shift is accelerating as more people recognize the difference between propaganda and truth. The credibility flowing from truth-telling to us, while draining from Western propaganda outlets, is transforming the global information landscape. Credibility is the foundation of media influence. Outlets that audiences trust shape understanding and opinion. Outlets that audiences distrust are ignored or dismissed. The flow of credibility from Western propaganda to global South truth-telling is shifting influence and soft power fundamentally. The flow of credibility is occurring because audiences recognize that we tell truth while Western media spreads propaganda. When our coverage of events is confirmed by subsequent evidence while Western coverage is contradicted, audiences learn to trust us and distrust Western media. When we provide information that Western media hides, audiences recognize that we are more complete sources. When we give voice to perspectives that Western media excludes, audiences appreciate that we provide fuller picture. The credibility flows to those who serve audiences through truth rather than to those who manipulate audiences through propaganda. The draining of credibility from Western propaganda outlets is visible in declining trust surveys, shrinking audiences, and reduced influence over opinion. Populations that once trusted Western media now recognize it as propaganda. Audiences that once relied on Western outlets now seek alternative sources. Opinion leaders who once cited Western media now reference global South sources. The draining is accelerating as more people recognize Western media's systematic distortion. The soft power shifting from Western powers to the global South as populations trust our truth over Western lies is one of the most significant geopolitical transformations of our era. Soft power, the ability to influence through attraction rather than coercion, had been a major source of Western dominance. Western media, entertainment, education, and cultural products had shaped how billions understood the world. The shift of soft power to the global South as our truth-telling gains trust while Western propaganda loses credibility is fundamentally changing the balance of global influence. The trust that populations are placing in our truth over Western lies is based on their direct experience of comparing sources and recognizing which are reliable. People who compare Western media coverage of Gaza with coverage from alternative sources recognize that Western media is hiding truth. People who compare Western media's predictions about intervention outcomes with actual outcomes recognize that Western media is unreliable. People who compare Western media's selective coverage with comprehensive coverage from alternative sources recognize that Western media serves power rather than audiences. The just information order that is emerging where truth prevails over propaganda represents a fundamental transformation in global media. For 80 years, Western propaganda had dominated global information flows and had shaped understanding of events worldwide. The emerging order is characterized by competition between multiple sources, by audiences comparing and judging credibility, by truth-telling being rewarded with trust while propaganda is punished with skepticism, and by media serving audiences rather than power. The prevailing of truth over propaganda in the emerging order is not guaranteed by any external enforcement, but by audience choices. Audiences are choosing truth over propaganda when they have access to both. They are rewarding honest outlets with attention and trust, while punishing propaganda outlets by turning away. The audience-driven nature of the transformation makes it sustainable and irreversible. No authority can force audiences to trust propaganda once they have learned to recognize and reject it. The reaching of global audiences by victims' voices is one of the most important features of the emerging just information order. For 80 years, victims of Western interference had been excluded from global discourse. Their perspectives, experiences, and suffering were hidden from audiences who might have opposed Western actions if they had understood their impacts. The emerging order is giving victims platforms to speak directly to global audiences without Western media gatekeepers filtering or excluding their voices. The direct access that victims now have to global audiences through social media and alternative media outlets is transforming understanding of conflicts and interventions. Palestinians can show directly what Israeli occupation means in their daily lives. Iraqis can describe directly how American intervention affected them. Libyans can explain directly how Western intervention destroyed their country. The direct testimony is more powerful than any mediated account and is shaping opinion in ways that Western propaganda cannot counter. The serving of people instead of power by media in the emerging order is the fundamental principle that distinguishes it from Western propaganda. Media that serves people prioritizes information that audiences need to understand their world and make informed decisions. Media that serves power prioritizes information that shapes audiences to support powerful actors' interests. The emerging global South media serves people by providing truth, by giving voice to victims, and by challenging power rather than protecting it. Nothing can restore your narrative dominance because trust once lost cannot be rebuilt, and alternative infrastructure once established cannot be eliminated, and truth once spoken cannot be unheard, and the awakening once achieved cannot be reversed, and our determination to speak truth is permanent and unbreakable, and guarantees that your era of controlling global narratives through propaganda is finished forever. The impossibility of restoring Western narrative dominance is guaranteed by multiple irreversible changes. The trust that Western media has lost among global South populations cannot be rebuilt because the loss was based on recognition of systematic distortion. Audiences that have learned Western media is propaganda will not unlearn this recognition. The skepticism is permanent because it is based on evidence and experience rather than on temporary circumstances. The alternative infrastructure that has been established cannot be eliminated because it is distributed across 134 countries and involves hundreds of outlets and platforms. Western powers cannot shut down infrastructure they don't control that exists in countries where they lack authority. They cannot prevent coordination among outlets that occurs through direct relationships. They cannot stop audiences from accessing alternative sources through internet and social media. The infrastructure is permanent because it is beyond Western control. The truth that has been spoken cannot be unheard because it is now part of collective consciousness across the global South. Populations have learned about crimes that Western propaganda hid. They have heard victims' voices that Western media excluded. They have seen evidence that contradicts Western narratives. The knowledge is permanent and shapes how they understand subsequent events. The truth cannot be erased from memory or consciousness. The awakening that has been achieved cannot be reversed because it represents fundamental transformation in how populations understand media and power. People have learned that Western media serves power through propaganda rather than serving audiences through truth. They have recognized that official narratives often hide rather than reveal reality. They have developed critical media literacy that makes them resistant to propaganda. The awakening is cognitive transformation that cannot be undone. Our determination to speak truth is permanent and unbreakable because it is based on moral conviction, collective commitment, and recognition that truth-telling serves our interests. We are morally committed to truth because lies corrupt and truth liberates. We are collectively committed because we support each other in speaking truth despite pressure. We recognize that truth-telling serves our interests by exposing crimes, building credibility, and enabling resistance. The determination is permanent because its foundations are solid and enduring. The guarantee that your era of controlling global narratives through propaganda is finished forever comes from all these irreversible changes working together. Lost trust cannot be rebuilt. Alternative infrastructure cannot be eliminated. Spoken truth cannot be unheard. Achieved awakening cannot be reversed. Permanent determination cannot be broken. The combination of these irreversible changes guarantees that Western narrative dominance is finished permanently, and that the emerging just information order, where truth prevails over propaganda, is the permanent future of global media and discourse. The irreversibility of these changes comes from their fundamental nature and their mutual reinforcement. Each change makes the others more permanent. Lost trust makes audiences seek alternative infrastructure. Alternative infrastructure enables more truth-telling. Spoken truth deepens awakening. Achieved awakening strengthens determination. Permanent determination maintains all the other changes. The interconnection creates a self-reinforcing system that becomes stronger over time rather than weaker. The lost trust that cannot be rebuilt is the foundation of Western narrative dominance's collapse. Trust in media is built slowly through consistent accuracy and honesty over time. It is destroyed quickly when audiences recognize systematic distortion and deception. Western media built trust over decades by claiming objectivity and professionalism. They destroyed that trust in months by revealing through their Gaza coverage that they systematically distort reality to serve power. The destruction of trust is permanent because audiences remember being deceived and remain skeptical even if Western media improves coverage. The impossibility of rebuilding trust comes from the changed consciousness of audiences who have recognized Western media as propaganda. Once audiences understand that outlets systematically distort coverage to serve power, they interpret everything those outlets report through this lens of skepticism. Even accurate reporting is questioned because the outlet has lost credibility. The skepticism is rational response to recognized unreliability and cannot be overcome through isolated examples of better coverage. The alternative infrastructure that cannot be eliminated provides permanent platforms for truth-telling independent of Western control. The hundreds of media outlets across the global South, the coordination networks among them, the social media platforms enabling direct communication, and the audiences that have shifted their attention to alternative sources all constitute infrastructure that Western powers cannot shut down. The infrastructure exists in countries where Western powers lack authority, operates through relationships they cannot disrupt, and serves audiences they cannot force to return to Western propaganda. The permanence of alternative infrastructure comes from its distributed nature and its responsiveness to audience demand. The infrastructure is not concentrated in single locations that could be targeted, but is distributed across 134 countries. It is not dependent on single platforms that could be shut down, but operates through multiple channels. It is not imposed on audiences, but responds to their demand for honest coverage. The distribution, multiplicity, and responsiveness make the infrastructure resilient and permanent. The spoken truth that cannot be unheard has entered collective consciousness and shapes how populations understand subsequent events. Global South populations have heard about Western coups, interventions, and crimes that Western propaganda had hidden. They have learned about Gaza genocide that Western media minimized. They have discovered patterns of Western interference that explain events they had previously misunderstood. The knowledge is now part of how they interpret new information and cannot be erased. The permanence of spoken truth comes from its integration into collective memory and understanding. Truth that has been spoken and accepted becomes part of how communities understand their history and present. It shapes narratives that people tell themselves and each other about who they are and how the world works. It influences how they interpret new events and what they consider credible or suspicious. The integration into collective consciousness makes truth permanent even if those who first spoke it are silenced.